administration. No problem. And I moved into, as sort of these inaugural roles were beginning, vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I moved into first an inaugural dean for inclusive excellence, and then I moved into most recently a vice presidency at Barnard College. And both of these roles were inaugural, and I talk in the book about what does that inaugurate? What does it mean when an institution brings in vice presidents for diversity, equity, inclusion, and what does that signal about the institution, and what does it actually do? So in these roles, it was a bit of a kind of strange habitation for myself as a philosopher of education. What I was enabled to understand and see actually, though, was inside the workings of the institutions, and see how boards of trustees functioned, how decisions were made at the highest levels, and how the system of higher education really what often drives the way in which decisions are made and the values which are held internally. So it provided me with kind of I guess the way I've always worked is I'm interested in how ideas and theory function on the ground and function in reality, and function in the institutions or environments that we find ourselves in. So what began to emerge from this was really seeing, not actually understanding what this was all about. So what was DEI, and really what was I doing here? And what were we all doing when we said we were doing DEI work? So that led to, quite a long time of thinking and looking. And as I was working in these roles, it led to a lot of reflection and writing, which is really what I think this book for me was. And part of what was difficult to write was that, often, oh yeah, thanks, Jason, diversity, equity, and inclusion is DEI. So what was difficult about the book was it is the critique of diversity work in a moment where obviously I think we can see the degree to which there's what we call anti-DEI legislation happening across the United States. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly to start us out before I kind of dig into the argument in the book. So the Chronicle of Higher Education has been compiling a kind of DEI tracker to show the legislation efforts across the country. So kind of like, what's the quantity, what's the outcome of these attempts to pass legislation that would prohibit colleges and universities from having diversity, equity, inclusion offices or staff. Many of these bills attempt to ban mandatory diversity training, prohibit institutions from using diversity statements in hiring and promotion, or promote colleges from using race, sex, color, ethnicity, gender, or national origin in admissions or employment. And there's particular institutes behind this legislation, and we don't have to go into that, but they're being crafted by very specific think tanks and institutes. So far 38 have been introduced, 6 have final approval, 6 have been signed into law, and 26 have been tabled. So you can get a sense, right, of where things look. So the brown is failed to pass, and the dark green is signed into law. So really, signed into law is really North Dakota, Tennessee, Florida, Texas. So really, many of these bills obviously are not necessarily passing, but where they are passing, like we see in Florida, there's a very immediate impact on universities in closing or dissolving or laying off of any staff related to diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as attempts to stop faculty from teaching particular types of material. So we are also literally maybe on the eve of the Supreme Court ruling on 2 cases regarding affirmative action that could dramatically kind of change how affirmative action is approached in the United States. They're supposed to hand the ruling down tomorrow or Friday. So we'll know. So what was hard about writing this book for me was, even before this was happening, I was in the kind of throes of writing this book and really seeing that, knowing what it's like to work in these jobs, how actually unsupported a person can be, how much critique one receives, both from faculty, administrators, students, kind of from all sides, in spite of it being held up as the sort of silver bullet that will solve all problems within the university space around racism or discrimination. So, but what I really strongly felt was that, the mandatory trainings, a lot of the ways in which DEI is approached is in service of an aim, which I come to explain in the book, is connected to an epistemology of difference. And when I say epistemology of difference, we can think about it as a way of knowing how difference is approached and understood and inhabited by the university, is what I came to really want to understand. And why was diversity the term that we applied to signal this kind of commitment to difference, and the way in which institutions sought to sort people. For me, it was something that I wanted to kind of understand more deeply. So it really led to this book and to really investigating from a decolonial, I think, really rooted in philosophy, but in critical theory, to want to offer insight and a way to think together about, when we say diversity, equity, and inclusion, what do we really mean? What are we trying to really get at? And what do we lose actually when we use these terms? And where does it not get us? So I'll read a little bit from the book here and there, and then kind of intersperse, and really feel free to kind of ask questions. We're a small group, and jump in with kind of things that you want to clarify or raise. I think using the chat the way that Jason had asked. So, I think to start out, I want to kind of talk about difference, and really, we have to probably, start briefly. Like I said, we're on the eve of this ruling of affirmative action. So, for those who might not know, I'll start us off with a little bit of reading about kind of the last decision that set us on this path of what we would describe now as the diversity defense, or where did this kind of idea of diversity really come from? So in 1978, Alan Bakke, a young white man, sued the University of California, Davis Medical School for reverse discrimination. He claimed that he met the school's admission criteria and was denied admission twice because of his race. At the time, the university reserved 16% of the seats in its incoming class for minority applicants under its affirmative action program. The US Supreme Court ultimately ruled that the university could not apply racial quotas in the service of affirmative action, but that diversity, or the presence of difference, was a compelling educational interest. The Bakke decision marks a line in the transition of race equity policy in the United States, and it marks the birth of the diversity defense that would come to be used by higher education in its efforts to increase the participation of historically marginalized groups, Black, Latinx, Native American, women, in historically white institutions. The claim that diversity and anti-racist efforts signal or enact discrimination against white people in spite of evidence that shows whites still outpace Blacks in earnings, health outcomes, and social mobility is, according to the research of social psychologist Cheryl Kaiser, on the rise in the United States. Before tracing the rise of the diversity defense after the Bakke decision, I want us to reflect on the words of Justice Powell Jr. in the opinion. So Powell writes, "There is a measure of inequity in forcing innocent persons in Bakke's position to bear the burdens of redressing grievances not of their making. I understand this to reveal an epistemic failure, or a failure in how we understand, right? A failure in our knowing, and one that's permeated a persistent social imaginary around redress, reparation, or equity-based policies in the United States. So this kind of statement really led me and has led many people to want to reflect on, when we hear the word reparation in our society, you can kind of just for fun go online and look at, comments to any article that references reparation. And there's a very strong, obviously, response even to the idea that one should provide redress to someone else for something that they have not done. And I think we can probably, hear an echo of this even in conversations around student debt, right? So, why should any student debt be abolished? That was a mistake or a choice that somebody made. So why should there be any redress for something someone else has done? Why should I take that responsibility? So I think in the book a great deal about this idea of responsibility taking, and how saying that kind of as an onto-epistemic position or a way of being, ways of knowing in the world, we actually don't have a really deep or good understanding in our society about what reparations or reparative activity or reparative ways of being means. So, I, in the book, offer that as kind of not an antidote to diversity, I would say, but saying that these are not the same things. So when we say diversity now, you'll hear administrators in higher education talk about diversifying faculty or diversifying their student population. And I would say that in my experience, more often than not, diversity has become a way in which to not say, we need more Black students. We have profound anti-Blackness in the academy. We need to redress long histories of exclusion of low-income students, right? It becomes this way to deflect or distract from the way that higher education actually is like a seed bed, which has cultivated and grown racism over many, many generations, and to acknowledge and take responsibility for the way in which higher education has participated in the production of inequality in our society. So I think that, what's important for me to communicate to you tonight also is that in the beginning of the book, I try and trace where diversity has come from and why we need to understand reparative activity as quite distinct from diversity. So what I kind of began to think about and delve into again, which I'll talk about and read a little bit here, is, I think that there's a lot of evidence that in the moments where colonization and settlement of what we call the Americas happened, there was a way of knowing that folks were bringing with them at the time. And it centered around kind of a capture and collection of difference that was encountered. And so I'll read a little bit to you about my thoughts on that. So an example of how coloniality approached difference and developed knowledge was through the invention of the curiosity cabinet, or what was called the Wonder Common. The Wonder Common, also known as cabinets of curiosities, were originally rooms that displayed collections of various objects, plants, and animals. The process of collecting and categorizing objects, plants, animals, and humans encountered during the travels of wealthy white European men, conquerors, or missionaries, came to underlie the modes of knowledge production that shaped the museum as well as the modern university. Bruce Robertson writes, the practice of collection, organization, and taxonomifying of the unfamiliar expressed and shaped an epistemology of difference and one that underlies the modern university. He argues that not only is the curiosity cabinet the ancestor of these institutions, but importantly, the wonder common shaped how many of the disciplines that constitute the modern university came to conceptualize and relate to difference, particularly differences that were encountered through conquest, colonization, and slavery. So in part of the book, what I try and do is examine the practice of creating curiosity cabinets, which provided a kind of knowledge or a way of knowing, as a way of knowing that founded universities today. And I kind of argue that this is what also has led to shaping diversity work as we understand it, because we have to understand that universities have always sought to organize difference, to place and accumulate difference, and ensure that it functions in very specific ways in very specific parts of the institutions that it finds itself within. So Nick Mitchell, who may have participated in one of these, I'm not sure. I encountered some of their work, and they say something really important, I think, is that, difference makes a difference. But often in higher education, it wants to accumulate difference, particularly Blackness or indigeneity, but it doesn't want to make a difference or shift or change the institution in any material way. We can describe this as assimilation, but the process of accumulation I try and talk about is actually from this colonial way of knowing that really wants to ensure not that difference doesn't unsettle or unravel the structures and procedures of institutions. And speaking from someone who was asked and hired to do diversity work, one of the things that became very quickly apparent to me was that processes of unsettling or fundamentally changing the way in which institutions functioned was not really on the table when it came to diversity work. Diversity work is about accumulating and including into an existing system according to pretty strict categories of participation. And that goes for, I think, people who have to, I'd say, I think a diversity statement is helpful. And, in theory, I can understand why folks might want that. But it prescribes a mode of participation that reproduces this type of colonial epistemology. Yeah.
Well, let's see if Scott's got a question, if you want to let him hop in here.
Yeah, definitely.
This is a great discussion. Thanks for bringing up all these great topics. So I went to Cornell, and Cornell had a real revolt by Black students in the 60s. It's a very famous picture of coming out and holding a gun. Yeah, exactly. And they created the first, I believe it was the first one of the very first African-American studies programs. And it was a demand of the students. And then we had a lot of ethnic studies program. How did that play into this idea of diversity? Because it seems like, and I had people say this, which I thought was just pretty much a crap, but they said that some of these things didn't have a very long history, so they couldn't trust them as much as they did the white history or something, which I thought is that's pretty gross, because white history just ignores all the other histories. But did that lead to this idea of diversity and a difference at all, like having that come in, or because that seems like a reflection. How did that play into it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I have a section in the book actually on Willard Straight Hall, which is the moment that you're talking about, right? And there's this famous picture of Black students coming out of Willard Straight Hall carrying guns. And I kind of went into looking at this because it's a chapter that's on, what I try and say is that how we get actually at reparative activity is actually also through poetics. And one of the ways that poetics has been enacted is spatially, and the use of counter space and the use of spatial politics is actually pretty core and central to what I think of as reparative actions. So the Willard Straight Hall action is really, I think, important, and this happens in 1969. So it's kind of like just as the civil rights statutes are beginning, just as more students, Black and mostly Black Puerto Rican students, are entering universities, the Pell Grants are starting. I think actually what I find really interesting about your question and important is that I think that this is a moment where people who run universities kind of say, oh, uh-oh, we need to find a way to control the participation of difference and discipline it. So I actually think that in some ways, the way that diversity, equity, inclusion work has evolved is a type of disciplining of the way in which when difference had entered and said, we're making a place for ourselves. And I think what's really important is that in a lot of the literature, it's described as a takeover of Willard Straight Hall. So, but the white students who are actually kind of attacking the Black students, and it's not described as a holding of their place, right? So the language that's used is, I think, also really important. And I think that the act is actually a kind of claim for place and a claiming of the space that we own this and we do belong here. So I think, and I think it's also interesting that the picture that Time decides to put up is the one of the Black student with the gun versus the white students burning the cross on the lawn, or the like those decisions.
Yeah, I think a bunch of frat brothers actually tried to break in violently and try to throw them out, and it wasn't until after that attack that the guns came in, and anyway.
Right. Yeah. And I think that, the fact that the media describes it as a takeover and not an attack, right? The language that's used, I think around space. So I think, that those type of examples are really important to look at, is how students, Black students, even in CUNY fairly recently, students of color who've had spaces, when the university attempts to take those spaces or prevent access, I think there's always that contestation of space, but that's not diversity work, right? That's considered student protest, and one of the primary roles that many vice presidents of DEI or DEI officers have been asked to play is to manage student protest, particularly or faculty discontent, like of the students and faculty who are of color. So, I think that when we think about reparative work in higher education, from my perspective, it's very much also about space, right? How space, who gets access to space, who has say over how space within a university is used. And by space, I mean both like student unions, dorms, territory, like knowledge territories, so disciplinary space, classroom space. So I think like those are all, dimensions of also how, when we think about reparative endeavors, I, in the book, talk about how the importance of counter spaces and how we can use space actually within universities as a way to contest or reinvent or envision something different, much in the way that the Young Lords and the Black Panthers used spatial politics as a way to help folks envision what was possible. And I think for myself, reparative activity is not just the kind of allocation of money for a harm. It is a mode of being that unravels the kind of ways in which we're used to functioning. Because when we truth tell, we actually clear space for something kind of new to emerge. So, it's about material, but I think it's for me, most importantly, within the context of universities, is to really think about, you know, when we talk about reparative activity, it's related to how we know, how we behave in the world, our sense of relationships with others. I think I see another point in the chat that we can talk about.
Yeah, Phil, do you want to maybe say a few words about what you said? Because I think this definitely comes up in Ariana's work. And I know, having worked on the Upper West Side, Ariana's pretty familiar with this one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went to Penn undergrad in West Philadelphia, and just, you know, decades, generations of gentrification. And so I don't know, just interesting to contrast the space issues on campus and off campus and their relationship, and obviously a lot of racism and capital accumulation and dispossession. I mean, part of a broader set of forces, one of the main ways the university interacts with its environs. But anyway, yeah, just seeing
Yeah.
relate. So
I think it's really important aspects of this idea. And I think what's also, you know, so we think about the diversity efforts of institutions. Most frequently, these institutions are located in places that outside their gates, if we just talk about some of the most elite institutions, right? So like Yale and Columbia and Brown and Princeton, Harvard, they, you know, even Dartmouth, which is rural, they actually have what we would consider to be a lot of diversity, a distinctive population from the population that is within the gates. But the recruitment is to bring diversity from somewhere else, which I think, again, is we can think of this as a colonial behavior. Like a student has to come from somewhere else and be kind of dropped into this place temporarily to settle. That then, you know, the community outside, which, like in the case of Columbia University, they're the biggest landowner in New York City, I think, or second biggest, you know, real estate holder in New York City. And they take land pretty regularly, right? Like they absorb and accumulate it in order to increase their value, right, as an institution. But the idea of how, you know, with Columbia, the longstanding tension with the Black community of Harlem, you know, the very famous case in Morningside Park where they were building a gym, literally with 2 different entrances in the 60s, that was, you know, finally blocked. But the language that's used is very, you know, we can see the residue of coloniality within how it behaves. So the way that universities, they, you know, really alter the environments around them while also sometimes dispossessing or not, you know, engaging with what the diversity outside the walls of the institution. And I think for myself, that's something when we talk about the challenges that with DEI work is, if we're not talking about reparative work, then we're not talking about how the ways the university behaves. The way the university behaves is often still a legacy of some of these colonial behaviors or colonial ways of knowing, where you kind of take land, you continue to extract labor from precarious workers in order for the institution to survive. I think, and also, you know, I think we can think about the hierarchy of human value that still exists in many institutions between, you know, professors or cleaners. So saying that there are these kind of ways of knowing that still permeate, you know, endowments are still invested in, you know, you have places like institutions like Harvard that still hold investments, you know, in, you know, parts of the world in which they're buying up water. So I have some specific examples I can cite, but My kid's crying in the background. Sorry, a little distracted. Any other
Ariana,
questions? Yeah, I can.
there's a point that I've been wondering as you've been speaking. Can you say something if someone says, "Oh, but diversity work is reparative work"? What do you say to that? Like, because some people, I think, and a lot of well-meaning liberals will say, "Well, we're diversifying, and that's our form of doing the repair." How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can include reparative activity, right? Like, I don't think it's mutually exclusive, but I think that what happens with diversity, equity, and inclusion work is it often becomes a way in which to evade responsibility taking in material ways. And I think that reparative activity is about significant modes of unraveling and materiality, commitments to materiality. And I think that oftentimes DEI efforts can commit to materiality, like they're administering scholarships, they're drawing students in. And I think that that's important, but oftentimes they're drawing students in my experience, to environments which are alienating, deeply violent in some ways, psychologically to some students. But also I think, they're not committing to shifting the way in which the university relates to difference, that relationship, what I say epistemically, is still fundamentally the same. It hasn't shifted. And the DEI worker is still sort of held in a particular place relationally that doesn't allow, because reparative activity is an undoing, it's an unraveling. And we don't actually know the outcome of where that undoing will take us.
Anya, go ahead.
Hello. I wanted to actually touch base a little bit, Jason, with your question that Ariana was answering too, with like my personal experience. So I'm an executive assistant over at OHSU, but I'm also a chair of the Pride Employee Resource Group, which basically tries to create space and improve the environment for LGBT folks that work at OHSU. So OHSU is a university, it's a hospital, it's a research center. They have over 20,000 employees. My experience as far as diversity versus reparative work, Ariana, you really hit it on the head when you were like talking about your experience when you were going to DEI work. My experience is, so Pride or ERGs, employee resource groups, are under CDI, which is a diversity DEI department, basically at OHSU. And my experience with that is the DEI department exists, and they're creating space for these demographics of underrepresented employees. However, they're more performative rather than action oriented. And it's a way for the university to basically say, like, we're giving you space so the underrepresented people can be tokenized and do all the work, and do the uncomfortable conversations, which need to happen for change, right? And to be the thorn on the side and to do all this data-driven work to try to prove our points and improve systems, only to not see any actions. Mm-hmm. And my other experience is the people in these seats are more like yes people, not people that are empowered to have these uncomfortable situations and go against the grain and to fight for the people, right? So that's been my experience, and I feel like it's a good example of the difference between reparative versus having a DEI department, diversity led kind of structure. So yeah, I appreciate this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are great points, and they kind of bring out, I think some of the important things to think about. And when you're experiencing it, it's a little bit like, what's really confusing? What's happening? And then like again with the anti-DEI legislation, my book was coming out. I said to the editor, I was like, oh, are people going to think that I'm like in support of Ron DeSantis or I don't know. But clearly not, because it doesn't care about decolonizing or anything like that. But it feels strange when you're like, they're giving us space, and it's very hard. So I think like you have to, if we think about the neoliberal construct of the university, where the labor and the work is, put onto the individual, but that nothing about the system of that you're operating inside is actively shifting, or the way power is distributed. So the thing that I say a lot is like, there are some DEI folks who are, in there with very radical agendas, but they have no resources and no real authority. So they're like put in there, and they don't actually have power. So, I think it's saying like, well, who has power, and then who's actually in that position of power making material change based on what like the people in the ERG are saying. They're saying, actually, this is a hostile work environment for queer people. Here are the things we want to see happen. But it's kind of often then like, well, we can do it in this kind of, constraint. So it's sort of saying like, well, I don't know, pick your Ivy League university. You have billions of dollars of endowment. Why is it not free? Or why have you not redistributed your resources? Or pick your university. Like, why is the board of trustees not, you have a land acknowledgement now. Why doesn't an indigenous person, or why doesn't the nation that you have the land acknowledgement for sit on your board of trustees and make decisions about allocations of resources, right? So I think that's where it gets, you're in that space and you're like, this is really confusing, and why is nothing happening? And nothing's happening because they don't, like, to make something happen means fundamentally shifting the structure of the way you unravel the way a university functions.
Brian, do you want to read your question and or paraphrase it?
Yeah, I try to boil it down. So I work at a public regional university in West Michigan. And, there's been talk about, declining demographics in the States, and, panic and hysteria over, how are we going to put butts in seats. And also, I mean, this is a serious issue. I mean, some of these universities, especially here in Michigan, get a lot of support from the state, and it's difficult to be financially solvent. But I've noticed in the past couple of years, not just at my university, but at other regional public universities, there's been a kind of a ramping up of DEI rhetoric. At the same time, there have been rather, I think, aggressive efforts to entice students from historically, disenfranchised communities to take out loans and come to school, which also in many cases means working long hours. And many of these students are underprepared. At my university, we just started an open enrollment policy, and we have the most diverse, largest freshman class that we've had ever. And there's a lot of, talk, amongst faculty, although not like very open talk. I think rather guarded talk among some concerned faculty members, that this is like, corralling students, right, and selling them to a state of indentured servitude, right? And there's worries that you won't be able to retain these students. They'll be in debt. Many of them won't have the opportunity to come back, and that just further complicates folks' lives, right? And it's just really tragic when you think about it.
Yeah, and I think that for sure, this predatory inclusivity or predatory inclusion is this idea of like accumulation, the need to literally accumulate bodies in order to survive, right? It's kind of dark and dark mirrory, but it's quite real. And I think that you know, and it's sort of this, again, this double bind, right? Because you're like, well, we need students, we want students, we want to have open enrollment, but we can't, as an institution, make the like be honest about the fact that there's no supports here. Like we're not making the investment into the supports, right? So it's kind of like, you know, when you go to some of these, you know, I walk around college campuses and, you know, I'm like, well, there's the shiny new building and
Yeah.
that's great. But like, you know, I worked at Bard College for a very eccentric president, Leon Botstein, who you can read the book. But one of the things, you know, he said a lot, you know, lots of the buildings are falling down. Bard costs $80,000-$90,000 a year to go there, right? It's like, what is happening here? But he was always like, we shouldn't invest in buildings, we should invest in students, right? And faculty, right? So that's kind of a refreshing position, but it's still $90,000 a year, right? But I think it is a really, you know, it's one thing to say like, oh, you know, universities are predatory, there's this, and they are to some degree, but there's a complexity to the funding of higher education that we're not addressing, right? That has led us here. The disinvestment by the federal government, like we're investing in war, billions of dollars, but we have no money to invest in higher education. So that, you know, combined with institutions that there is a type of predator, they're not being upfront about the amount of debt that the student will end up with. They're not being upfront about, you know, the lack of supports that, you know, they're not investing in. I think, like you said, like student affairs or even like academic support services, or even disability support services, right? We see college campuses that mental health needs are, you know, far and away at a level where they never have been. And there's just not enough investment there. So I think like, and there's no transparency. So that's the other piece is where's the transparency around the money and how money works, and how very powerful, rich people with a lot of money get to have a say over like a new fountain versus like there's students who are starving and hungry within a university, right? So like it can be a really, it's both complex, but also I think quite straightforward, right? In a way.
So I wanna be careful with Ariana's time, and we're coming up on an hour. And so maybe what we can do is Tanya and then Scott, if you could ask your questions back to back, and then if anyone else has a comment or question, you could ask your question, and then Ariana, maybe you can kind of briefly address that, and then we'll wrap things up because with your daughter crying too, I don't want to hold you too long.
Oh, she's stopped now. She's in bed. Something happened. I don't know.
So Tanya, Scott, and then anyone else that wants to make a comment or question, just please, we'll take those and then we'll round things out.
Yeah, so Ariana, you touched on the finances of wanting to make these kind of changes, and that is definitely how I reframed my work, is the bottom dollar. How can we frame these requested changes in a way where it looks attractive financially? Because that's, I feel, the biggest driver for a lot of the universities and organizations as a whole. So I would love to hear kind of maybe some strategies as far as how do we frame such things like we need to give more money to students from these demographics so they can afford to have the education, so they can then move into roles in healthcare, which is, you know, severely impacted for queer folks. So those type situations, I would love to hear your feedback on that. And also, how does one handle censorship of universities not making stances due to fragility of their funders?
Big question, Scott.
Yeah, so I'm glad the financial aspect is coming in, because, you know, I just don't believe it can be truly equitable unless you deal with poverty. We have students who are homeless, we have students who are sleeping in cars, we have bread lines, and I could tell you the students who, you know, just proportionally, this is the way our society, because of racism and history, we know who's in the bread line. We know the more students. And, coming from being in Europe where like college is free, it is really a sick and twisted situation that we're in. So but the other thing that I think is addressing, and I bring this directly to the president all the time, they have cut staff to the bone. They refuse to pay them any amount. And I look at our staff in our department who are worked at like poverty wages, what I consider poverty wages. They're worked to the bone under incredible stress. And these are women of color, right? I mean, there's huge numbers. They cut them, they slash them. And then they're like, well, we really like diversity and equity. It's like you are missing a portion. You're treating a portion of your college and maybe a lot of your population, both poor students and staff, with such disdain while paying yourself huge salaries that I feel like it's just, I just want to vomit, really. I really feel that. And I tell the president, and all I get is, oh, we're going to hire a few people. It's like, yeah, well, you can't pay him $30,000 a year and live in San Diego. That's disgusting. How, I just want to throw the whole process out. And anyway, sorry, I'm going to do one more thing. But the last thing they did was they said, we're going to do a reparations. And they kind of said it like this, by charging international students to pay for Black and Indigenous scholars. I'm thinking, wait, you're going to charge my student from Mozambique to repair colonialism in the United States? Swear to God, they're going to charge him $3,000 extra in fees a year. I was like, I couldn't even believe what I was hearing. So I feel like the problem is the people with the money don't want to pay anything. These are the people who take the salaries, the rich people who run the boards, and the people who refuse to pay taxes, who actually own the land, who actually, Governor Newsom, he should be doing reparations. He has oil and gas. He owns vineyards. And so why are we making the international student from India or from Kenya pay for it? So anyway, it's a lot to dump on you. It's a very important topic, but it's driving.
Yeah. No, I have a lot to say about both those questions, which both relate to tactics, I think, right? Like for me, there's a tactical part of all of this. So, yeah. Was there another question we could add in? Or,
no, I think if you want to wrap up with some
sure.
closing comments, that would
be so
fantastic.
I mean, I think so we can take even like, both of your questions kind of tie also to like how institutions both have to and choose to position themselves in relation to the interests of very wealthy people. And that's just kind of this fact of higher education. Again, this idea of, not saying or taking positions in certain issues because the alumni base who donates will get angry and withhold money. And the idea that you have to then be neutral because, we didn't even get into neutrality tonight, which I think is sort of fascinating place to talk about a conversation. You have to stay neutral because you can't upset, this either party. The people who hold the money and hold the power, like in the case of public institutions, right? Like the legislative power, who are also usually you're connected to you're very wealthy. So I think that, there's this reality that you need to look at transparently, like where does, the institution actually spend its money? I think someone mentioned consultants, and I work as a consultant now, but not really now because I don't get hired much right now because I'm talking about that's just true. But it the amount of money that actually institutions do spend on image management behind the scenes, like kind of public relations, like those types of consultants, consultants that will scrub the internet when a scandal happens, right, and ensure that the search results don't raise certain things that the institution doesn't really want people to find. Reputational risk, right? Like they spend money on these things. And there's a whole kind of host of things, like where is the money actually going? What are the salaries, right? Like the salaries are quite large. I mean, in public institutions, you can actually see them. In private institutions, in many places, you're looking at pretty big salaries. If it's a public that's not super well funded, they're going to be more than some faculty for sure. They're going to be way more than like your most what I consider to be frontline staff, like the staff that you're describing. And again, like this lip service, right? Like it's no coincidence that there's an excerpt of my book in the Chronicle, and the title of it is Higher Education's DEI Lip Service. If you want to read that. And it, I think it should be understood that the reason why in some places DEI is being dissolved so quickly is also because it's not actually entrenched in the culture, values, and systems, the belief systems of the institution, right? So if it's like you're saying, if it was such an important value, then why is your staff, who in many institutions like San Diego, New York City, who are mostly Black and brown individuals, in the cleaning staff, they're among the lowest paid people in the institution and can barely survive sometimes on what they're making. But they're talking about DEI. So it's DEI as what's called a decorative shield, right? And there is some good legal writing actually that describes DEI and diversity actually as it's a decorative shield. It's a compliance shield in order to evade certain types of real material responsibility. And I think where money is spent. And then and then there's this whole conversation of, the inverse of Powell's decision, which is grievances not of their making. We shouldn't be responsible for grievances not of our making. The inverse of that is then, privilege. The privilege is not of our making. The privileges that many people have of inherited wealth, and where that comes from, should that also not be kind of their making? And I think legacy admissions, access to special interest piles for admission, not having to have debt. I mean, it's constant conversation in any institution I've been in. Is, students who are working a 30-hour job while juggling tons of debt that they're carrying, a full course load, while their peers are going out to dinner and living in their apartment in New York City, and never working. So the inequality on campuses that a student experiences is quite vast and significant because it reflects the inequality of the country, right? And I think you should be outraged. We should all be outraged that we have students in breadlines and sleeping in their cars, and we seem to be able to expend money on things like war, but be comfortable with students emerging with $100,000 in debt for their undergraduate education, and that they were brought in on a scholarship. So there are students who come in on a full ride, let's say, to a private institution. They come in on a full tuition, right? Full tuition scholarship. And their families are told they have a full tuition scholarship. And many times if they're first generation, they don't understand that that doesn't include room and board. So room and board at some places can be $25,000 a year. So 25 times 4, they end up leaving undergrad from just room and board with, an extensive like 40 to 65,000. And I have families and people now that have worked in higher ed for years, where should I send my kid? I'm like, you should send your kid to community college for 2 years. And then you should support them to transfer. If you're looking at your child taking on like 60,000 in debt for their education. And then we talk about reparative activity. There's all those conversations. So if we really care about diversity as Columbia University, and there's all these, it's not a great example because CUNY is this pretty strong system, but you're in a place where there's community colleges that are underfunded, and they're full, statistically, 80% of, Black, low income, Latino students, Latinx students. Why are you not creating more robust partnerships? Why not distribute some of your resources there? Why not find creative solutions? So really, it's like where the material commitment arises, and how you exert pressure for those material commitments to happen. And I think sometimes like the taking of space and the making of space is really important as part of those kind of tactics. And I think supporting students and acknowledging what it is they're experiencing, and staff, because I think there's many, many staff who, it's a crisis in higher ed right now. There's just, no one wants to do the work. Like I routinely see staff who just, they walk away. They don't even have a job. The lowest paid kind of like, again, frontline staff.
Ariana, I want to thank you once more for creating this space for us, this conversation, and for writing this book. Again, I highly, highly recommend it. It's really well put together. It's poetic, it's beautiful, and it makes a strong case. And I just want to say once more too that I really appreciate how you center the material issues here about basically show me the fucking money.
Yeah.
Which is so really refreshing.
I'm like, sometimes it's just sort of like the evasions to actually put the money into commitments is really, it's quite a thing.
Absolutely. So for those of you that are here, I just want to announce once more that we have a whole series of summer offerings from Debt Collective on a variety of topics that are related to debt. So war and debt, housing, well, not housing, we're not doing yet, but we will, university, others. Please join us. Pay attention to the news the next couple of days. As Ariana mentioned, rulings from the Supreme Court in the United States about affirmative action and also student debt. We will be having a debtors meeting. I don't know, Nick or anyone else, if you could put in the chat. We'll have a call tomorrow after the ruling to talk about what now after the Supreme Court rules one way or the other. Even if they do rule in the favor of debtors in this case, there's still over $1 trillion worth of debt to cancel. So the fight continues. And worker-owned universities, that's right. Thank you all for coming. Margaret from Mexico. All right. I think is where you were. I would love to know how you found out about this. If you stay on for a second, I'd just out of curiosity. And please join us in the future. Thank you so much. And
thank
have
you
a very good night.
And for coming tonight and for thinking about this together. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thanks
Ariana.
again.
Thank you, everyone. Take care of yourselves.
Take care. Thanks.